Good morning, buenos dias, bon dia, bonjour, and welcome to the Americas Update, the regional briefing we're having as part of the AGM. With me today, I think you know, Peter Cerdá, our Regional Vice President for the Americas, who will take you through an update sort of going from north to south. You will then have the opportunity to ask questions. We'll take your questions in English and in Spanish, whereby we might just do the English ones first, because I know some of you might want to leave for the next session, but I'm pretty sure we can manage that. And with that, I think I can hand over to Peter.
Thank you, Marcus. Good morning, buenos dias, bon dia, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to see many of you that I've seen over the last year and a half through Teams and Zoom. It's nice to see everyone in person. First of all, let me start by saying that thank you very much for the support that you have provided our region over the last year and a half through our virtual sessions and the very effective communication that you've helped us in our advocacy with governments and stakeholders throughout the entire region, from Canada to the US down to Latin America. So we're very much appreciative of the strong power of the written word that you help us in our advocacy. While many of you know that the Americas is quite a diverse continent, from North America to South, COVID has left a trail of human and economic devastations all the way from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego. If we begin to look, and we have some slides for you today, how do we stand today? Some 1.5 years after traffic across the globe essentially came to a halt. We're seeing progressively liftings of travel restrictions across the continent. More recently, countries with some of the toughest border measures like Argentina and Canada have either reopened their borders to international visitors or have put a plan forward. The U.S. has also announced the opening of its borders to all vaccinated foreigners as of November, eliminating the current 212F restriction. Yes, we are on a good path forward and expect the entire continent to be open for business as of November. And that is our expectations, our hope that by the time we get to November, the governments will have put into place those plans of reopening with full recovery shortly coming after. The path to full recovery in our region will take time. It will not come overnight, and we will face many challenges and unexpected hurdles on the way. If we look at the economic forecast for the region, North American carriers are expected to outperform other regions on the back of the fast recovery of the U.S. domestic market. The U.S. industry started to turn cash positive in the second quarter of 2021, and it will be the only region in positive financial territory next year in 2022, with an expected $9.9 billion profit. When we look at our Latin American carriers, we'll see losses cut from $5.6 billion this year to $3.7 billion in 2022. The strength of the U.S. Latin America market will be a major contributing factor to improvement, both for the Latin carriers but also the neighboring North American carriers. Significant restructuring costs as the region carriers adjust to the new business realities will weigh on the financial performance, keeping the region in a collective loss. If we look at the next slide, while common threads across the region are maybe not that obvious, there are some issues which hold true from north to south as we see traffic picking up. And many of you have heard me numerous times talk about many of these. First, let me start with the improved need for cooperation from governments, especially related to managing border controls. We understand the government's primary focus has been dealing with this public health crisis. Nevertheless, we have now lived through 18 months of constantly changing restrictions, often imposed at short notice and with no consultation. And unfortunately, many of you know this has been the common theme for most of the countries. In most cases, it is then left to the airlines to ensure that passengers can comply with the often complex rules and regulations. We're no longer in 2020, And with the vaccination levels on the rise, governments should be in a position to provide timely and clear guidance based on scientific evidence and not on political pressures. But this is not always the case. A case in point, the recent announcement by the U.S. government that as of November, only vaccinated international travelers would be allowed to enter the country. And while this is the right way forward in replacing the current 212F restriction, the lack of further details is hampering operational planning for the airlines and the passenger confidence. If we move south, while having one of the most successful vaccination campaigns in the region, Chile continues to mandate quarantine on top of vaccination and negative PCR to enter the country, which simply kills demand and will not stimulate the restart of international traffic to the country. So you can go to Chile, you have to be vaccinated, you have to have a PCR before you take off, a PCR when you land, and then you get the luxury of spending 5 days in a hotel in quarantine. Not the way to restart. When we look at the second item, we need governments to accept digital testing and vaccination certificates and agree to a common standard as border restrictions are being lifted. If both airlines, customer service agents, and immigration officers need to manually check and validate paper documents, this will massively increase passenger processing times. And we've had these examples in places like Santiago, Chile, Buenos Aires, when passengers have to wait 3 to 4 hours just to get out of the airport terminal because of all the ground checks on the ground. That's why we welcome the move by Panama to base their digital COVID certificate system to the EU standard, ensuring interoperability on the international level. The third case, and this is coming back to normal business, the issue of increased charges, fees, and taxes imposed by various players along the value chain, such as airports, air navigation service providers, or indeed our governments. Now is not the time to unilaterally begin to try and claw back financial losses brought about by the pandemic. We need a joint effort to rebuild the value chain, and airlines cannot shoulder the burden on their own. And you've heard us many times on the need of transparency and partnership with government, something that we have not had in a long time by the vast majority of them. Fourth, new consumer protection initiatives are also a development in which we are watching with some concern. We're not against consumer protection per se, but we need to respect global best practices and standards. Some of the proposed legislation, particularly in Latin America, will ultimately lead to higher fares and less choices and passengers choosing to fly elsewhere. Fifth, sustainability is the key element of building back the industry from the pandemic. While industry has already made great progress on this front, governments and other players in the value chain need to start playing their part, creating a framework in which, for example, the production and distribution of sustainable aviation fuels can be supported. And this is a strong call to action, particularly in Latin America. Before I take your questions, I would want to take you through a quick snapshot of the various markets from north to south, just to give you a bit of an overview of each country. And I'll start from north. Let me start with Canada. Canada has had some of the toughest border restrictions during the pandemic. International traffic was essentially halted from March 2020 through August of this year. Since September, the country has been welcoming vaccinated international visitors once again. And while we support and applaud this move, a solution leading to the acceptance of more than just those vaccines approved by the Health of Canada must be found, along with an option for those who cannot get vaccinated, like for medical reasons or for children. On the charges side, the proposed increases by its air navigation service provider, NAV Canada, will adversely affect the industry just at a time when traffic is recovering. And yesterday you saw our Director General, Willie Walsh, show the numbers of the increases by NAV Canada. If we move south to the United States, we all know that the U.S. market has recovered well on the domestic front, and with U.S. citizens being welcomed back in many parts of the world, international traffic has also regained strong momentum. The planned lifting of restrictions from the so-called 212F countries will certainly increase demand. However, as I mentioned before, the government needs to urgently provide on how the vaccine mandate will come into effect for passengers entering the country. Airlines need to know so they can plan their schedules and implement any operational changes required, and passengers want to know how they can begin to book. And we're only less than a month away. I also want to bring to the attention that we have issues on the airport front. Due to the formulas used to calculate charges, in this case to foreign airlines operating at U.S. airports, airlines are facing increases despite the reductions in flights. Airports such as Boston, Los Angeles, San Francisco are case in point. This is a time to work together and collectively for the benefit of all. And our call to action is that we sit down with our U.S. counterparts to look for solutions that will bring benefits both to the airline community, to the airport community, and overall to the passengers. And with the progress being made on airspace modernization, we need to make sure that we continue to push forward in our good cooperation with the FAA on NextGen. NextGen will bring efficiencies, better reliability, and CO2 emission savings in the U.S. airspace. Shifting to Mexico is one of the few markets in the region, but also in the world, that never closed its borders during the entire pandemic. Domestic travel has already recovered to pre-COVID-19 levels, and international traffic is also showing a positive trend. On the infrastructure side, the conversion of the former Santa Lucia Air Base into the third civilian airport for Mexico City metropolitan area is progressing, and IATA and the industry is collaborating. While this will bring badly needed extra capacity, we need to ensure that airlines are free to decide which of the three airports they want to serve to, solely based on the commercial and operational requirement and not based on political pressure to move to a particular airport. IATA is also supporting the efforts by the Mexican regulator, AFAC, to regain the FAA Category 1, which would aid in expanding international traffic between the U.S. and Mexico, and it has become the #1 safety priority for our member airlines and IATA in Mexico and in the region. Shifting gears to the Caribbean, the Caribbean was also one of the first regions to reopen in the second half of 2020. And although some countries have just recently lifted entry restrictions, this has allowed for tourism to return while observing the various COVID protocols. While overall this region is on a good path forward, increases in charges, taxes, and fees need to be avoided as not to dampen demand. And just a few examples. In the Dominican Republic, there are plans to increase airport services fees by 6.3%. In Suriname, the government has recently announced an increase in sales taxes from 8 to 12%, and further increases in the current $35 airport facility fee also seems to be on the card. In a country that up to just a few months ago had very limited air service, and now we have begun to see more air service, this is not the right way to generate even more. Unnecessary infrastructure projects like the proposed airport in Barbaro in the Dominican Republic is not needed and should be avoided. Yes, we need new infrastructure where it makes sense, but not in this case. The new airport would only cannibalize traffic from the already existing Punta Cana International Airport. In Central America, similar developments to the Caribbean, we saw that those markets relying heavily on tourism being first to reopen their borders and using testing as a means of controlling the pandemic. While traffic has shown good signs of recovery, planned increases in fees and charges, like in Costa Rica or El Salvador, will again be counterproductive. On the infrastructure side, the new airport in Palmerora Airport serving Tegucigalpa in Honduras is set to open later this year. This will provide an opportunity for airlines to increase service to the country. I will also say on the flip side, in Guatemala, where the government wants to construct a new cargo airport, is an area of infrastructure that we strongly disapprove. We've showed consistently in our region having a cargo and a passenger airport just does not make good financial and business sense. Colombia is another country that underwent a gradual reopening after passing through the peak of the pandemic. Domestic travel has rebounded to pre-COVID levels, to just under pre-pandemic levels, and international traffic is showing very promising signs of recovery. Operationally, we are facing issues at Bogota Airport due to the implementation of ground delay programs nearly on a daily basis and ATC inefficiencies. While the reasons for these are manifold, the responsible authorities need to start implementing measures to alleviate this. As an industry, we have made a variety of short and medium-term proposals to improve the current situation. However, we are still awaiting implementation. Solutions must urgently be implemented as the delays are preventing airlines from offering reliable service to customers and damaging Bogota's position as a regional hub airport. Legislative initiatives on various consumer protection bills continue to be discussed in Congress. Congress needs to understand that we want to be a strategic partner. They need us. We need to ensure that aviation can provide its economic contribution to rebuilding the country rather than treating us as an adversary. Shifting to Ecuador. Ecuador was one of the first countries to reopen its borders to international traffic, which helped in early recovery of traffic to the country. Recent changes to the foreign exchange tax regime should also provide stimulus for international traffic to and from the country. Ecuador has a golden opportunity to promote tourism and business by reducing its taxation and become a competitive force in the region. And Peru closed its international traffic for nearly all of 2020, but has progressively reopened. Lima Airport is currently experiencing capacity issues related to COVID-19 protocols, which is causing delays and operational restrictions. Hence, we welcome the decision by the authorities to grant an increase of 5 flights per hour for the upcoming Northern Hemisphere season. In the longer term, the already delayed expansion of Lima Airport must be carried out, as other ways future additional traffic cannot be accommodated, and this is needed as one of the top priorities of the government, that it invests and ensures that Lima can continue to be one of the important hubs of the region. In Brazil, similar to Mexico, the country never fully closed its borders, and its large domestic market was one of the first to rebound. At present, however, arrivals from India, South Africa, and the UK are still prohibited. Also, all passengers entering or even transiting through Brazil must have a negative PCR test. In line with the global advocacy efforts, IATA is seeking for the acceptance of antigen tests as an alternative to PCR. During the crisis, the government did not provide any direct financial relief, and airlines continue to face heavy taxes in the country, such as the 15% withholding tax on aircraft leases, which is simply unacceptable as the industry tries to recover and regrow its connectivity. The government and industry suppliers must see the airlines as key partners and reduce costs where possible. The country's current jet fuel pricing policy adds $255 million in costs per year for the airlines and must be revised to Jet A fuel. And the adoption of an open and fair access to fuel infrastructure can result in further cost savings and efficiencies. Lastly, we're advocating for open and effective consultation on airport concession contracts, which will be the key for our member airlines to grow sustainably and to bring more connectivity to Brazil and its vast population. Argentina had some of the strictest and longest border restrictions in the region. Not only were foreigners barred from entering the country, the number of daily international arrivals has also been capped, one of the few countries in the world to do this. However, there is now light at the end of the very long tunnel, and I say very long time. During the months of October, will gradually increase to 4,000 daily passengers, up from the current 2,300. Once the country reaches 50% vaccination threshold, the daily cap will be removed along with the antigen test on arrival. Progressively, the border will reopen, beginning with the arrival of neighboring countries, followed by other countries. We would like to thank the government, particularly the Chief of Staff and the Minister of Health, for finally taking steps that will help the industry to recover, being able to take advantage of the upcoming summer hemisphere season. One item that still will, however, hamper the recovery of the continued high taxation in the country. Since 2020, tickets issued in Argentine pesos carry the heavy burden of two taxes, a 30% plus a 35%. Since February 2021, the airport passenger international fee will increase from 51 to 57. Not a way if you want to generate connectivity to the country. And lastly, but not least, Chile. Chile has also had very strict border restrictions in place, which allows only citizens and residents to enter the country, coupled with strict quarantine rules, even vaccinated travelers. Even though vaccinated foreigners have been able to enter the country since 1 of October, the 5-day quarantine rule does little to stimulate the market. It's essential that the government review the quarantine rules to vaccinated passengers. On the regulatory front, several initiatives are currently being debated in Congress pertaining to consumer protection. This will drive up cost and not necessarily provide the improved consumer protection. So, in summary, overall, we can conclude that across the Americas, we have seen the worst of the crisis, we hope. However, we're not out of the woods, and we must avoid the return of draconian travel restrictions as and when COVID cases flare up again. Governments now have the tools at their disposal to control the spread of the virus, the best one being vaccinations. Aviation will be critical to restoring the livelihood across the region. And as you all know, particularly in our part of the world, where ground transportation is very limited, air travel was the way to save lives by moving medical equipment, medical staff, and then the vaccinations. After all, aviation in pre-COVID times in the region contributed to $1.287 trillion to the continent's GDP and supported 16.4 million jobs across North America and Latin America. You've heard me say many times, we just cannot return to 2019. If we return to that environment, we will be regressing instead of moving forward. We need our governments to collaborate, to be competitive, and to work with the industry in a collaborative manner. And with that, I'm open to taking questions.
So, questions, if we can do maybe 2 to 3 English, and then we could do a few in Spanish. Also, if you're following us online, please put the questions into the chat. So, I guess, Carlo? And just mention the publication and you're from, and my colleague Marcin is coming around with the mic, so you don't have to shout.
Buenos días. The question will be in Spanish.
Okay.
Buenos días. Peter, con la situación de Chile podría complicarse aún más. El Ministerio de Salud ha anunciado la posibilidad de que solamente las personas vacunadas puedan acceder a viajes en avión. ¿Cuál es la posición de IATA al respecto, o si tienen considerado cuánto podría impactar esa medida a la aviación chilena?
Okay, can I just do a very quick translation? So this has to do with the proposal by the Chilean government to only allow vaccinated passengers to actually fly. So, Peter, over to you.
Bueno, de nuestra parte, obviamente, nos gustaría que abrieran las fronteras sin ningún tipo de restricción, pero sí entendemos que debido al alto riesgo que contiene, el proceso de PCR, antígeno y vacunaciones será, en el corto plazo, una medida para poder acceder al mercado. Estamos trabajando y queremos colaborar con el gobierno y pensamos si esa es la vía para reabrir como un primer paso obviamente lo apoyaríamos. Lo que queremos es que no hayan cuarentenas. Eso es la restricción o la medida más restrictiva que tenemos. Cuando hay cuarentenas, los pasajeros simplemente no van a ir.
Perdón, la reflexión es en doméstico también, esa posibilidad de que eso fuera, que solo las personas vacunadas pudiesen volar también para volar doméstico. ¿Necesitarían un pase de movilidad o un certificado al respecto?
Esperemos que sea a muy corto plazo. Un país no se puede sostener solo con los pasajeros vacunados. Tenemos que encontrar alternativas como el PCR, antígeno. Por razones médicas o de salud, hay personas que no van a poder vacunarse, por lo menos inicialmente. Así que es importante que el gobierno, y sobre todo en Chile lo hemos pedido muchas veces, que tenga un plan de acción, de implementación, que haya gradualmente pues un mejoramiento de los protocolos que se van a utilizar. Pero el tema de abrir el mercado para pasajeros vacunados, pero sin cuarentena, sí lo apoyamos.
Do you want to just
Yeah.
recap that in
Yeah,
English?
I'll just say that we do support that. The main goal in Chile is to remove the quarantine measures that we have in place. Simply having quarantines for domestic movement or international arrivals will not generate or stimulate passengers to return to the market or begin to fly. So from our point of view, we support the government's initial mandate to approve freedom of movements for vaccinated passengers, but we also encourage the government, for those passengers that cannot get tested for medical reasons or other reasons, have options through antigen or PCR testing so they can be part of the transportation movement of people.
Okay, are there any questions in English? Then we'll go for Pia, no sé, ¿lo quieres hacer en español o inglés?
Do you hear me? Sí? Okay. So, yes, my name is Pia. I'm from Revista Semana from Colombia. I would like to ask you, you were talking about El Dorado Airport and the problems it's been having lately. What have you thought of a solution? What could the country do? Have you talked to the government or to the airport administration? Or do you think other capital cities like Cali, Medellin, or Cartagena, I don't know, could supply that demand that El Dorado isn't able to do? Thank you.
Well, El Dorado has the capability to have it. It has the infrastructure, has 2 runways. It has potential for growth. It just has been very, very inefficient to improve. We have ATC delays. We have ground delay programs every day on perfectly good weather days. It's the only airport in the world that has had GDP programs in place since May on a daily basis. No airports like in London or New York has had to implement ground delay programs on a daily basis, and particularly for the amount of time that it's placed in Bogota. What the authorities need to do, and we've been asking the government, we want to partner with the government to do a detailed capacity study and efficiency study of the airport and airspace area. We do believe the airport can manage more capacity in the future, but we need to make sure that the air traffic sector, the airport sector, has the capability to do that. There's no reason why Bogota should not be much higher in terms of operations per hour than what we have today. Today we have a slot control, very inefficient process in place. And if Bogota is going to compete with Panama, if it's going to compete with Lima, it needs to improve the efficiency that it does not have today.
But right now, we don't know the answer of why those problems are happening.
Oh, we know the answers. We need the Civil Aviation Authority to, implement better measures from air traffic control. We need to utilize better the movement areas of the taxiways, the runways. We need to redesign the airspace. We need to use Palenquero airspace, which is military airspace. And again, in many parts of the world, we use military airspace at the same time as the military. In this airspace, we just cannot use it. We're not permitted to use it. And that's a lot of square mileage that can be more effectively used if the military was to partner with the industry. So there's many low-hanging fruit items that can be put into place. where we would see more efficiencies, less delays, and passengers will be able to arrive and go to their destinations in a much more reliable and efficient way. Now, I will also say, you said Cali and Medellin. That's great potential. Cali and Medellin should not be the substitutes for inefficiencies for Bogota. Cali and Medellin should be growing because those cities are growing and there's potential growth, which I think is very positive for a country, that you will have Bogota as the main point of entry, but Medellin and Cali can be very good, strong secondary cities for international growth in the future.
Next. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Edgardo from Aviation Line. I'll move away a little bit from COVID, Peter, and ask you, unions are pressing the Argentine government to reinstate some regulations on commercial aviation, like minimum fares, handling service monopoly for intercargo, and to renegotiate bilateral agreements to protect national carriers. I won't ask you what do you think about that because it might be a little obvious, but do you think the government has political margin to do that? Do you think they'll move forward on those measures?
If we move down those measures, Argentina will be totally uncompetitive. And then Argentinians will ultimately be affected. And we've seen this in the past in Argentina. A few years ago when we went the opposite way, we opened the market. We gave more opportunity for the ultra-low-cost carriers to come into the market. Aviation began to bloom. Passengers began to take advantage. You had more Argentinian carriers. You had more people traveling from the country, within the country. And today, we're going in the opposite direction. You've seen Air New Zealand leave the market. LATAM has left the market. We don't know what the ultra-low cost will look like in a few years with Flybondi, JetSmart, what their opportunities will be. Will they go back to the low-cost airport? Will they have to stay in Aeroparque? The market needs to be competitive. You need to open the market and let the market or the consumers dictate the growth of that market. It's a market that has huge opportunities, potential, but every time that government gets involved, the situation worsens instead of improves. What we need the government to make sure is that we have a safe and efficient aviation environment in the country. That's what we need the government to do and work with them collaboratively. But what we want Argentina to be is more competitive. Let the market dictate what the pricing scheme should be. We shouldn't have a floor and a ceiling like we've had in the past. What we would like to see the government do is actually reduce taxations and fees in order to stimulate more travel.
You just want to clarify the LATAM, that it was LATAM Argentina.
Yeah, LATAM Argentina.
For domestic,
yeah,
but not
LATAM
for
Argentina seas.
Yeah, not the international. Next question, próxima pregunta.
You guys are being very nice to me today.
Just wait till later.
Hola, Peter.
In Argentina, I'm either loved or hated. You know that. Me quieren o me odian.
Okay.
Hola, Peter. Carolina Andúrraga del Mercurio de Chile. Me imagino que te enteraste de las intenciones de Avianca de fusionarse con Sky. Quería saber qué te parece esa alianza y si crees que esta va a ser la tendencia para los próximos años en la industria de la región. Si vamos a ver una consolidación, vamos a ver nuevas fusiones, eso.
Bueno, lo que son decisiones comerciales, nosotros no nos metemos, pero yo creo que estamos en un periodo que vamos a ver más consolidación, más oportunidades de negocios entre líneas aéreas. Es una aviación que se está evolucionando, está cambiando y al final va a ser bueno para los pasajeros. Va a haber más competitividad, más opciones comerciales y eso también obliga a la competencia a mejorar y en los servicios, en los precios. Así que para el consumidor va a ser bueno, para la industria estamos evolucionando, cambiando y eso va a ser una tendencia no solo regionalmente, pero también globalmente.
Ok, Okay, maybe just quick English translation. The question was concerning the sort of media reports that there's a possible merger between Sky and Avianca. So I don't know if you just want to say something
Yeah, so I'll say-
in general about mergers in the region.
We don't really comment on commercial agreements or mergers in terms of per se on the airlines, but from a general note, you know, our industry is evolving, it's changing, it's adapting to the changing conditions that we have, particularly in our region. From our perspective, this will be a growing trend. We see many opportunities throughout the region for greater synergies between airlines, possible mergers. We're seeing it all around the world. So seeing it in Latin America, I think it's encouraging. It will bring more competitiveness, more competition, better pricing, and more options for consumers. So it's ultimately, it will be good for everyone.
More questions, más preguntas? Katiuska, entonces, sí.
Katiuska Hernández, de Marte Financiero, Diario La Prensa de Panamá. ¿Para cuándo están previendo ustedes la estabilización de la industria aérea en la región a los niveles del 2019, si ha cambiado en algo? Y se habla mucho de armonización entre los países, pero no las vemos todavía. ¿En qué estatus está el IATA Travel Pass en América Latina, que iba a ser como un estándar para el reconocimiento de QR de vacunas?
Bueno, la recuperación todavía no ha cambiado mucho. Nuestro pronóstico son la vuelta del tráfico internacional sobre el 2024, el doméstico entre 2022 y 2023. Pero sí vamos a tener países, van a ir evolucionando distinto. En México, por ejemplo, el tráfico doméstico ya ha vuelto, muy parecido a Colombia. En países donde hemos tenido cierre de fronteras o las cuarentenas como Chile y Argentina, la recuperación puede ser que sea más larga y más difícil que fue en otros mercados. Así que a nivel global regional estamos estimando finales del 2023-2024 internacional, doméstico alrededor del 2022, pero va a depender mucho del levantamiento de las restricciones, las cuarentenas y qué puede venir más adelante. Si tenemos más variantes, cómo van adaptándose los países. Lo que sí esperamos en América Latina, como a nivel global, es si surgen nuevas variantes, que los países no regresen o hagan nuevamente cierre de fronteras, restricciones. Tenemos que mantener las fronteras abiertas, tenemos que mantener la conectividad, adaptando, modificando, pero no cerrando y regresando a lo que estábamos hace 5 meses. La otra pregunta.
La armonización de las medidas.
Mira, desafortunadamente, tengo que decir, no ha funcionado muy bien. No hemos aprendido del 9/11. Cada país implementó sus medidas, sus restricciones. No hemos tenido coordinación entre países y eso, pues, obviamente, no ha ayudado en la recuperación de confianza de los pasajeros. El IATA Travel Pass sí lo estamos trabajando con varias líneas aéreas de la región, con varios gobiernos también estamos hablando. Ya tenemos hemos trabajado de una manera muy exitosa en Panamá, pero sí estamos trabajando con otros países de la región para la utilización de la herramienta en sus países.
Okay, maybe just a quick recap in English. So the two questions were on the sort of recovery in general, and then also on harmonization, sort of on border control measures and the use of IATA Travel Pass.
So the recovery, what we've had as a baseline for our region is international recovery anywhere between end of 2023, beginning or during 2024, domestic around 2022. But we've already seen markets like Mexico has already recovered on its domestic market, Colombia very similar, almost to that level. But it's also going to be very dependent on how long countries maintain restrictions. If Chile maintains its quarantine restrictions for domestic and foreign movement, that recovery is going to take a lot more for passengers to recovering and go back to the pre-COVID 2019 levels, and particularly when you compare it to a country like Mexico that never closed and they have already recovered. So it's going to be very dependent on the accessibility that the governments give, and also making sure that since we don't know what comes in the future, the unknown is somewhat unknown. We need to make sure that governments adjust and adapt to possible new variants. But the one thing that we do call on government is that we don't regress like we've done in the past, where we've, again, closed borders, imposed restrictions of movement. We need to keep air transportation open, moving, and not bring back quarantines and closure of borders. I think I covered it.
Yeah, that's more or less all. So, más preguntas, more questions? Edgardo, sí?
Have you received any feedback from airlines in Latin America and the Caribbean regarding the net zero emissions goal proposed by IATA? Because there is a different reality in the carriers in the region next to European airlines or North American airlines. How do you think they would be able to implement that goal? Will they receive any support, extra support from IATA?
Well, there certainly is support because it was passed yesterday at the annual general meeting. So our member airlines do support it. Will we have challenges in Latin America? Absolutely. We need, one thing I will say, and you know this, many of our Latin American and Caribbean carriers have already announced sustainability initiatives throughout the region. So, you know, from all our members, from ultra low cost to hybrid to legacy carriers. So they certainly understand the importance and the responsibility on the sustainability issue. And we're seeing that derived with our member airlines in the region. What we do need is our government to put the right regulatory framework in place within their countries, and also put the right infrastructure in place. We need to be able to start the development and the availability of sustainable aviation fuels in order for this to work. So actually the call in our region is more to governments than to the industry. The industry, even with our airport partners, are also taking responsibility to ensure that they comply. We're working with air navigation service providers on more direct flights, more efficient flights, where you're going to fly less nautical miles, more reliability, and that will reduce the emissions of the CO2. So the call of action really here is on governments in our region. We have an opportunity. We need to be responsible. The industry is preparing itself, so we need governments from a regulatory and an investment perspective to do the same thing. And when I talk about this, it's more related to South America rather than North America. In the U.S., there's a very strong push, both from a governmental and the private side. So our call to action here is in Latin America. Ay, perdona.
Español, ok.
Bueno, sobre el tema del medio ambiente y la sostenibilidad. Obviamente hemos tenido el apoyo de nuestros miembros aquí en la Asamblea, que han apoyado la normativa que se va a poner en vigor. Como industria, obviamente sí tenemos preocupaciones a nivel de industria. Necesitamos los gobiernos en nuestra región de una manera regulatoria y económica de inversión de parte del gobierno para asegurar que tengamos combustibles sostenibles, que haya la infraestructura, los recursos, la parte regulatoria se ponga o se implemente en los países. En estos momentos, muy pocos países de nuestra región estamos posicionados para poder ir tomando un rol mucho más activo en esta materia. Eso sí, casi todas las compañías miembros de IATA en esta región ya se han comprometido para implementar programas de sostenibilidad dentro de sus líneas aéreas. Y da igual si son compañías ultra low cost, los híbridos o los tradicionales. Desde Colombia a Chile, a Brasil, a Argentina, la mayoría de nuestros miembros ya se han comprometido y están implementando esos programas de sostenibilidad. ¿Bien?
Bien. Ok, una pregunta más.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Soy Claudia Inga del diario El Comercio de Perú. Bueno, mi consulta iba específicamente por el mercado peruano. ¿Cuáles son los índices de recuperación tanto de los vuelos domésticos y de los vuelos internacionales? Y también cuánto ha retrasado un poco la recuperación de Perú con las idas y vueltas en algunos protocolos sanitarios, ¿no? De hecho, somos uno de los países que tuvo en un momento unas placas para subir a los aviones, luego la doble mascarilla, luego también hace un par de semanas un par de cambios respecto a las pruebas PCR y si es que permitían además el ingreso a los vacunados. No sé si es que eso ha perjudicado un poco nuestra recuperación. Y como tercera pregunta, ¿cómo ves la competitividad dentro del mercado peruano? Porque de hecho cambió muchísimo con la pandemia. Hubo un par de aerolíneas que salieron del mercado y otras que de alguna manera han logrado capitalizar ese espacio. Gracias.
Muchas preguntas. Vamos a ver cómo... bueno, uno de los temas un poco problemáticos que hemos tenido con Perú han sido las normativas que implementaron durante esta crisis sobre, como dice usted, doble mascarilla, las bisagras estas. Eso no ayuda. Lo que hemos pedido a nuestros gobiernos en la región siempre ha sido estandarizado. Cumplir con lo que se está recomendando la Organización Mundial de la Salud, lo que son las mejores prácticas, y en el caso peruano siempre íbamos un paso atrás a lo que era el resto de los países. Así que ahora estamos mejor, tienen normativas con el tema de PCR, estamos solicitando que implementen nuevamente el antígeno porque creo que lo han eliminado nuevamente, y eso es nuevamente... se están yendo más lejos de lo que es el estándar global, que es más utilización del antígeno. Así que lo que pedimos en el caso peruano es que sigan lo que es las normas, las mejores prácticas que se están llevando a cabo mundialmente. Infraestructura es un tema que nos preocupa mucho en el Perú. Es importante que se lleve a cabo el proyecto de Lima, es importante que para el Estado peruano, el gobierno federal, el proyecto del aeropuerto de Callao sea una de las prioridades del país para mantener ese aeropuerto como, obviamente, la entrada al país, pero como un eje estratégico regional, como un punto de tránsito, y que se mantenga competitividad como un hub. También los aeropuertos secundarios, porque hay una gran demanda y un gran movimiento de pasajeros dentro del país. También es importante que mantengamos la infraestructura en esos países. Lo que tenemos que hacer es reducir los costes, los precios son altos, las tasas son altas, y si Perú quiere ser competitivo y estimular más movimiento de pasajeros, tendrá que reducir los precios. No sé si me ha faltado una pregunta.
The numbers, I have the current numbers for Peru. I don't think we
No
have-
tengo, en estos momentos no tengo específicos, te los tendría que buscar para el Perú.
I mean, I can give you 56% down still domestic.
Lo que es, mira, lo que tenemos hasta ahora, todavía estamos el 56% por debajo de pre-COVID en el mes
De julio.
de julio.
Para pasajeros nacionales y mercado internacional son casi, 68% debajo del anterior. Espera, el micrófono para los otros. Sí.
Y la otra pregunta era respecto al nivel de competitividad que hay en el mercado peruano, porque de hecho nuestro mercado cambió mucho después de las cuarentenas en pandemia. Salieron un par de empresas locales, una que ya estaba medio afuera, y más bien se fortalecieron algunas low cost, ¿no? Por ejemplo, Sky. Y bueno, LATAM logró crecer de todas maneras en participación.
Yo creo que Perú es un mercado muy interesante para las líneas aéreas. Yo creo que el país está bien servido, y en el momento que una línea aérea decida salirse del mercado forzado o por sus decisiones, otras líneas aéreas entrarán en el mercado, tanto y cuando sea competitivo entrar en los mercados. Pero obviamente Perú es un país con grandes oportunidades, es un país que depende mucho del transporte aéreo, es un país que depende económicamente y de parte de turismo, así que yo creo que hay oportunidades. No va a ser un mercado que va a estar mal servido.
Okay, we're kind of 5 minutes after our time. I would just ask you to maybe do a quick summary on Peru in English, and after
Okay.
that we'll close the official part, but I know a lot of you want to speak to Peter one-on-one, and seeing we've done this sort of through Zoom for a whole year, I think maybe you just enjoy having a cup of coffee and talking face to face.
I'm surprised I just didn't get any question on Venezuela today. So.
Bueno, so just a final comment on Peru, and then
Peru
we'll
is,
finish.
as I was saying in Spanish, it's a country with huge amounts of opportunities, both domestically and international. It's a country that is very dependent on air travel, particularly within the country because of inefficiencies on the ground movement. But it needs to be competitive. It needs to have the right infrastructure. The government needs to prioritize the expansion project for the international airport in Lima. It needs to be a priority for this government, as well as other secondary airports. We also call on the government to ensure that the country stay competitive and not increase taxes and fees, particularly on the tourism that comes into the country.
Okay. ¿Tú lo puedes hacer con un café?
Ay, Dios mío.
¿Por qué sacaron las pérdidas de Venezuela de la contabilidad? ¿Por qué sacaron las pérdidas de Venezuela de la contabilidad? ¿Y cómo están viendo la conectividad actual? Porque se ha recuperado un poco, pero ellos esperan que Estados Unidos desbloquee el tema de las rutas. ¿Qué conversación tienen sobre esos temas?
Tenemos ninguna conversación, la situación no ha cambiado y vemos que el país sigue estando muy desconectado con el resto del mundo.
¿Y el dinero?
¿Qué,
¿Por qué lo sacaron de la contabilidad?
¿Quién lo sacó?
En un comunicado que las pérdidas no incluían lo de Venezuela.
Los blocked funds. Sí, bueno, lo hemos puesto todavía, que hay un montón de dinero bloqueado en Venezuela, pero
Sí,
la palabra
porque lo
Peter.
tenemos como perdido. Es un tema que ya lo hemos hablado durante muchos años. Las líneas aéreas ya no dependen, no esperan que algún día recuperan ese dinero, pero ya han decidido las líneas aéreas por perdido en estos momentos con el gobierno que está en el poder, por la falta de comunicación, alineamiento y la falta de querer de una manera u otra trabajar con la industria para recuperar un mercado que cada día, como hemos dicho muchas veces, está más aislado del resto del mundo.
Okay. Bueno, creo que ya
Muchas
podemos
gracias.
terminar. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
And I know many of you have individual questions. Do you want to top up the first cup? No.